In 1850, the nearest doctor to a pioneer woman in Kansas was a week's ride away. She delivered her own children, set bones, and kept people alive with nothing but what grew around her. Number 19 stopped the bleeding that killed more women in childbirth than anything else. Number 7 was removed from medicine, not because it stopped working. These are 25 forgotten cures pioneer women used. Number 25, rose hips for scurvy and immune support. Pioneer women who crossed the Great Plains knew something that ship captains had known for 2 centuries. People who did not get enough vitamin C stopped healing properly. Wounds stayed open, gums bled, bones ached. The condition had a name, scurvy. And the prairie had a remedy, rose hips, the seed pods left behind after the wild rose flowers dropped in autumn. A single tablespoon of dried rose hips contains more vitamin C than an orange. Pioneer women gathered them by the basketful in September, dried them, and added them to teas and soups throughout winter. A family living on cornmeal and salt pork through February needed those rose hips the way later generations needed vitamin supplements. Modern analysis confirms dried rose hips contain 400 to 600 milligrams of vitamin C per 100 grams, roughly 4 to 6 times the concentration of fresh oranges. The pioneer women who gathered them did not know what vitamin C was. They knew people stayed healthier when they drank the tea. Number 24, wild ginger for nausea and digestion. The low-growing plant with heart-shaped leaves and a hidden burgundy flower that hugged the forest floor of the eastern woodlands and the river bottoms of the Midwest was one of the first plants pioneer women learned from indigenous neighbors. Wild ginger, Asarum canadense, has no relation to culinary ginger, but was used for identical purposes. Nausea, digestion, the stomach cramping that came with contaminated water, and the morning sickness that accompanied most pregnancies on the frontier. The root was dug, dried, and simmered into a tea given to anyone with a stomach complaint. It was also used as a flavoring for food that had begun to turn. The aromatic compounds masked off flavors, and the antimicrobial properties helped slow further spoilage. Modern phytochemistry has identified aristolochic acid derivatives in wild ginger. At the very low doses of traditional tea preparations, the plant has confirmed antispasmodic properties that explain its traditional use for stomach cramping and nausea. Number 23, blessed thistle for milk production. When a pioneer woman gave birth and her milk was slow to come in, the baby faced a crisis that had no formula solution in 1860. The remedy that midwives and experienced mothers reached for was blessed thistle, Quinacus benedictus, brewed into a bitter tea and given several times daily to nursing mothers. Blessed thistle is a galactagogue, a substance that stimulates milk production, and it has been used for this purpose in European and American folk medicine for at least 400 years. The bitter compounds in blessed thistle, particularly quinatin, stimulate digestive secretions and appear to support the hormonal pathways involved in milk production through a mechanism that is not yet fully characterized, but is consistent with traditional use across multiple cultures. Lactation consultants in the United States today recommend blessed thistle as one of the few botanical galactagogues with reasonable traditional evidence behind it. The pioneer midwife who brewed this tea for a struggling nursing mother was working from centuries of accumulated observation. Number 22, skullcap for exhaustion and nerves. The blue-flowered native plant that grew in moist woodlands and along stream banks across eastern North America was the pioneer woman's nerve medicine, given for the jangling anxiety that came with isolation, for the sleeplessness of chronic worry, for the tremor and restlessness that followed illness, and for the exhaustion that never fully resolved, no matter how much rest was taken. Scutellaria lateriflora, American skullcap, was one of the most commonly used botanical sedatives in 19th century American medicine. Eclectic physicians prescribed it for hysteria, epilepsy, and nervous exhaustion. It appeared in the United States Pharmacopoeia from 1863 through 1916. The active flavonoids bioecolin and scutellarein have confirmed GABAergic activity. They bind to the same receptors as benzodiazepines, producing mild sedation without dependency. A 2014 double-blind crossover study confirmed that skullcaps significantly enhanced global mood without reducing energy or cognition. The pioneer woman who brewed it for a neighbor whose nerves had gone bad was administering a pharmacologically appropriate anxiolytic. Number 21. Partridge berry for childbirth preparation. Michela repens, called partridge berry, squaw vine, or two-eyed berry, was one of the most important women's medicines in Eastern woodland indigenous tradition, and pioneer women adopted it rapidly after learning its uses from indigenous neighbors. The small, creeping evergreen plant with bright red berries was given as a daily tea during the final weeks of pregnancy to prepare the uterus for labor. Midwives believed it toned the uterine muscle, shortened labor, and reduced the postpartum hemorrhage that was the primary cause of maternal death on the frontier. Historical herbalists, including Lydia Child, whose manual from 1833, The American Frugal Housewife, was carried by thousands of pioneer women, recommended partridge berry tea throughout the final months of pregnancy. The plant contains compounds with mild uterine toning activity consistent with traditional use. It remains one of the most widely recommended botanical preparations among certified nurse midwives in the United States today. Number 20. Dandelion as nutritional medicine. Pioneer women who understood their plants knew that the dandelion, dismissed by everyone else as a weed, was one of the most nutritionally complete plants growing on the frontier. Every part was useful. The young spring leaves, gathered before the flower opened, were among the most nutrient-dense greens available to a family that had eaten almost no fresh vegetables through winter. The root, roasted and ground, served as a coffee substitute that also supported liver function. The whole plant brewed into a tea served as a daily tonic that provided iron, calcium, potassium, and vitamins A, C, and K in concentrations that compared favorably with cultivated vegetables. Pioneer women gave dandelion greens specifically to children who looked pale by February, and to pregnant women who needed iron they were not getting from their winter diet. The bitterness of the root stimulates bile production and improves fat digestion, a function that mattered greatly to families eating a high-fat preservation diet through winter months. Here is what the history books leave out. The pioneer women who managed medicine for their communities were not amateurs improvising with whatever was at hand. Many of them carried formal medical reference books. Gunn's Domestic Medicine, published in 1830, went through more than 100 editions and was in hundreds of thousands of pioneer households. They corresponded with each other across distances. They apprenticed with indigenous healers who understood the local pharmacopoeia in ways no European medical text could match. They tracked outcomes across families and years. The knowledge they carried was not folk medicine in the dismissive sense of that phrase. It was primary care medicine, practiced by the only practitioners available to millions of Americans for most of the 19th century. 19 more. Number 19. Shepherd's purse to stop bleeding. When a pioneer woman gave birth and the bleeding did not stop in the minutes after delivery, it was postpartum hemorrhage. That condition killed more women in childbirth than any other single cause, so the midwife reached for shepherd's purse. Capsella bursa pastoris, the small weedy plant with heart-shaped seed pods that grew in every disturbed soil and garden bed on the frontier, contains peptides similar to oxytocin that stimulate uterine contraction and reduce postpartum bleeding. The preparation was a strong tea given immediately after delivery, sometimes applied as a saturated cloth compress. A 2012 review in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology documented shepherd's purse as one of the most consistently used hemostatic plants in traditional obstetric medicine across multiple cultures and confirmed its pharmacological activity. Pioneer midwives who kept it in their kits were carrying the correct intervention for the leading cause of maternal death on the frontier. Number 18. Beetroot for obstetric hemorrhage. Trillium erectum, red trillium or beetroot, was the other hemorrhage remedy of the frontier midwife, used specifically when shepherd's purse was unavailable or when the bleeding was more severe. The root was dried, powdered, and given as a tea or applied locally. Cherokee and Iroquois midwives had used it for the same purpose for generations before pioneer women adopted it through contact. The root contains steroidal saponins with uterine contracting activity. A senior physician writing in the eclectic medical literature in 1887 described beetroot as the most reliable hemostatic agent he had ever used in obstetric practice. It was more reliable than ergot, which was the pharmaceutical standard. The plant is now protected in several states due to overharvesting driven by the demand of the communities that knew its value. When a plant is overharvested, it is almost always because it works. Number 17. Blue cohosh for stalled labor. When labor stalled and a pioneer woman had been pushing for too long, with contractions weakening, a situation that in the era before cesarean sections was a genuine threat to both mother and child, the midwife gave blue cohosh. Caulophyllum thalictroides, the blue-berried woodland plant with distinctive blue-green leaves, contains caulosaponin and caulophyllosaponin, compounds that directly stimulate uterine smooth muscle contraction. The Iroquois, Ojibwe, and many other indigenous peoples used it for labor augmentation. Pioneer midwives learned it from indigenous neighbors, and it became standard practice in obstetric folklore across the American frontier. A 1999 survey published in the Journal of Nurse Midwifery found that 64% of certified nurse midwives in the United States were still recommending blue cohosh for labor induction or augmentation. Confirmation that the pioneer midwife's protocol had survived 2 centuries in active professional use. Number 16. Fenugreek for milk and strength. The seeds of the fenugreek plant, Trigonella phoenum graecum, came to frontier America through immigrant communities and were rapidly adopted across the frontier because they served 2 functions that pioneer families needed constantly. For nursing mothers, fenugreek seeds brewed into a tea or eaten in food supported milk production through compounds that act on the hormonal pathways involved in lactation. For anyone weakened by illness, fenugreek seeds provided concentrated nutrition. The seeds are high in protein, iron, and a soluble fiber called galactomannan that slows glucose absorption and supports blood sugar stability. Pioneer women who nursed through illness, through hunger, through the physical depletion that came with frontier life, used fenugreek as a restorative. Modern lactation research has confirmed fenugreek as one of the most consistently effective botanical galactagogues. A 2011 randomized trial confirmed fenugreek tea significantly increased milk production in the first 2 weeks postpartum. Number 15. Cleavers for kidney and lymph complaints. The sticky-stemmed annual weed that attached to clothing as tenaciously as its common name implied, cleavers, goosegrass, sticky willy, was one of the most widely used spring medicines in the pioneer household. Gallium aparine grew everywhere, required no cultivation, and appeared in early spring precisely when it was most needed after months of winter diet. Pioneer women brewed the fresh plant into a cold infusion tea, not boiled, because the key compounds were delicate. They used it for kidney complaints, urinary discomfort, and the swollen lymph nodes that came with spring infections. The fresh juice was pressed onto skin conditions, infected wounds, and the swollen glands of the neck that indicated the body was fighting something. Cleavers contains coumarins and flavonoids with confirmed diuretic and anti-inflammatory properties. The spring tonic tradition was pharmacologically rational, a diuretic and lymphatic herb given after months of heavy preserved food that taxed kidneys and immune systems simultaneously. Number 14. Lady's slipper for pain and sleep. The beautiful native orchid that grew in rich woodland soils, Cypripedium species, was the strongest sedative available to pioneer women who could find it. Cherokee healers used it for nervous conditions, pain, and sleeplessness. Pioneer women adopted it for the same applications, giving it for the tooth pain that could not be reached, for the chronic back pain of a life of physical labor, for the anxiety and sleeplessness of grief. It was expensive, not in money, but in rarity, as the plant was slow-growing and increasingly hard to find. By the 1880s, commercial overharvesting had made wild lady's slipper uncommon in many regions. The active compounds are not fully characterized, but alkaloids and glycosides in the root have confirmed sedative and anodyne properties. Today, all native Cypripedium species are protected. The rarity of the plant is the measure of how much frontier communities valued it. Here is the number that defines everything on this list. Between 1800 and 1900, the maternal mortality rate in the United States was approximately 500 deaths per 100,000 live births. In communities served by trained midwives using the botanical protocols on this list, the rates were lower, not because the plants were magical, but because the midwives who knew them also knew how to manage the conditions that killed women: postpartum hemorrhage, puerperal fever, obstructed labor. The clinical literature has confirmed, one plant at a time, that the protocols those women used were pharmacologically rational. They had the right tools, they used them correctly, and for most of the 19th century, they were the only obstetric care available to millions of American women. Number 13. Milky oats for exhausted nerves. When the nervous system was depleted, not by a single acute event, but by months or years of chronic stress, sleeplessness, grief, and physical overwork, pioneer healers reached for milky oats. Avena sativa, harvested at the milky stage before the grain hardened, contains avenanthramides and other compounds that the nervous system uses as building material. The preparation was either the fresh milky juice of the green oat tops, expressed directly and taken immediately, or a long cold infusion of the dried herb. Pioneer physicians called the condition it treated nervous prostration, or neurasthenia. Modern herbalists call it adrenal fatigue, or nervous system depletion. A 2011 randomized controlled trial confirmed milky oat extract significantly improved cognitive performance and reduced stress in healthy adults. The frontier medicine for the depleted woman who had nothing left was feeding the nervous system the nutrients it had consumed through months of living past its limits. Number 12. Wild yam for pain and inflammation. Dioscorea villosa, wild yam, grew as a climbing vine across the forests of the eastern United States. Cherokee and Choctaw healers used it for the colicky pain that came with gallbladder disease, intestinal spasm, and joint inflammation. Pioneer women adopted it rapidly for the same applications, particularly for the chronic joint pain of middle age and the abdominal cramping that came with menstruation and digestive illness. The root contains diosgenin, a steroidal saponin that chemists in the 1940s discovered could be converted in the laboratory into progesterone and cortisone, the discovery that launched the entire synthetic steroid pharmaceutical industry. Dioscorea villosa was the starting material for the birth control pill. A vine-climbing fence post on the American frontier contained the molecular building block of one of the most consequential pharmaceutical developments of the 20th century. Number 11. False unicorn root for miscarriage prevention. Chamaelirium luteum, false unicorn or fairy wand, was the botanical treatment for threatened miscarriage in 19th century American medicine. When a pregnant woman began to cramp and spot in the early months, the eclectic physicians, the botanical practitioners who treated millions of Americans before pharmaceutical medicine took over, prescribed false unicorn root as their first intervention. The root contains steroidal saponins with confirmed effects on hormonal balance. Eclectic medical texts from the 1870s and the 1880s describe false unicorn, as the most reliable uterine tonic available. It was distinguished from blue cohosh in its action. Blue cohosh stimulated contractions, while false unicorn toned the uterine muscle to hold the pregnancy. Whether this distinction was pharmacologically precise or not, the observation that different plants produce different obstetric outcomes indicates a level of clinical sophistication that the dismissal of pioneer medicine as superstition does not account for. Number 10. Blue vervain for nervous tension. Verbena hastata, blue vervain, grew in wet meadows, along creek banks, and in damp, disturbed soils across the American continent. The tall plant with small purple flowers massed on candelabra-like spikes was a nervous system medicine in multiple indigenous traditions and was rapidly adopted into pioneer practice. This was given for the tight, held tension that came with chronic overwork and stress. The person who could not relax, whose shoulders lived near their ears, who had headaches behind the eyes from holding everything together too long. Blue vervain was distinguished from skullcap in its application. Skullcap was for the anxious and sleepless. Blue vervain for the rigid and tense. The plant contains verbenin and other iridoid glycosides with confirmed antispasmodic properties in smooth and striated muscle. Modern herbalists continue to use blue vervain for exactly the tension pattern that pioneer healers described. The specific application for a specific pattern of presentation is clinical knowledge, not superstition. Number 9. Red clover for respiratory illness and women's health. The familiar farm plant with pink-purple flower heads that grew in every hay meadow and roadside across the continent was a medicine in pioneer households that most members of those households never thought of as anything special. It was simply there. Red clover blossoms brewed into a tea were given for persistent chest coughs, for the chronic respiratory conditions that would not clear after acute illness, and for the women experiencing the hot flashes, sleep disruption, and mood changes of menopause. The plant contains formininetin and biochanin A, isoflavones that bind to estrogen receptors and produce mild estrogenic effects. A 2007 meta-analysis published in the journal Maturitas confirmed red clover isoflavones significantly reduced hot flash frequency in menopausal women compared to placebo. The pioneer grandmother who brewed red clover tea for the change was delivering phytoestrogen therapy that a clinical meta-analysis confirmed over a century later. Number 8. Chickweed for skin and inflammation. The low-growing, stellate-flowered annual weed that appeared in every cool season garden, every disturbed soil, every fence line in early spring was not weeded out in households that understood it. Stellaria media, chickweed, was the cooling remedy for inflamed, itching, burning skin. Applied as a poultice of the fresh plant or as an infused oil, it treated eczema, psoriasis, the itching of insect bites and rashes, and the painful skin conditions that came with friction, heat, and outdoor work. Taken internally as a tea, it was used for inflammatory conditions. It treated the hot, swollen joints of rheumatism and the inflamed throat of tonsillitis. Chickweed contains saponins and flavonoids with confirmed anti-inflammatory activity. A 2012 review documented chickweed's traditional applications across multiple cultural contexts and confirmed the pharmacological basis for its anti-inflammatory and antipruritic properties. The weed that gardeners pull was the medicine that pioneer households cultivated. Number 7. Self-heal for wounds and fever. Prunella vulgaris, self-heal or heal-all, carried a folk name that was a clinical statement. The small purple-flowered plant that grew in disturbed soils and lawn edges across North America was used for wounds, fevers, sore throats, and what healers described as conditions of the blood. Pioneer women applied the bruised herb as a poultice on infected wounds and cuts that were slow to close. They brewed it for feverish children and for the sore throats that preceded illness. The plant contains rosmarinic acid, the same anti-inflammatory compound found in lemon balm and rosemary, along with ursolic acid with confirmed antimicrobial properties. A 2012 study documented Self-Heal's antimicrobial activity against multiple bacterial species. A plant common enough that no one thought to cultivate it was carrying real pharmaceutical chemistry available to anyone who bent down to pick it. Number 6. Lemon verbena for fever and digestion. The fragrant South American shrub that Spanish colonists brought to North America became a kitchen garden plant in frontier households that obtained it through trade. The lemon-scented leaves were used for fevers, brewed into a hot tea that promoted diaphoresis, the sweating that broke a fever by morning. They were also given for digestive upset, for the bloating and cramping of a diet heavy in preserved foods, and as a pleasant-tasting base for medicines that would otherwise be refused. Lemon verbena contains verbascoside, the same anti-inflammatory compound found in mullein, and citral, a volatile compound with confirmed antimicrobial properties. A 2004 study confirmed that lemon verbena extract significantly reduced markers of oxidative stress and inflammation. The kitchen garden plant was doing pharmaceutical work in every frontier household that grew it. Number 5. Violet leaf for respiratory and skin. The common violet, viola species, which bloomed in every shaded lawn and woodland edge, was considered medicine in pioneer households that knew the spring gathering calendar. The leaves and flowers, rich in vitamin C and mucilaginous compounds, were given for the dry, irritated respiratory passages of winter illness and the inflamed skin conditions that came with poor nutrition and outdoor work. Violet leaf poultices were applied to breast lumps, swollen lymph nodes, and slow-healing wounds. The Iroquois, Cherokee, and many other indigenous peoples used violets medicinally, and pioneer women who learned from indigenous neighbors brought the practice into their own households. Violet leaves contain rutin, a flavonoid with confirmed anti-inflammatory and capillary strengthening properties, and significant mucilage that soothes inflamed tissue. The flower in every lawn was a medicine that required nothing to obtain except the knowledge of what it was. Number 4. Lavender for burns, wounds, and anxiety. European lavender, Lavandula angustifolia, traveled to frontier America in seed packets carried by French, Spanish, and English settlers who understood it as a medicine before it was a fragrance. Pioneer women grew it in every kitchen garden that had enough sun and dry soil. The essential oil, distilled from the flowers, was applied directly to burns, cuts, and insect stings for pain relief and to prevent infection. The dried flowers were sewn into pillowcases for sleepless children. The tea was given for headaches, anxiety, and the nervous exhaustion that accumulated through frontier life. Linalool, the primary active compound in lavender essential oil, has confirmed anxiolytic properties. A 2014 randomized trial found an oral lavender preparation significantly superior to placebo for generalized anxiety disorder. A 2016 review confirmed lavender's antimicrobial and wound healing activity. The kitchen garden plant that made the air smell clean was also doing pharmacology. Number 3. Wood betony for pain and digestion. Botanica officinalis, wood betony, was carried to America by British settlers who considered it one of the most important medicinal herbs in the English tradition. Medieval herbalists claimed betony cured 47 conditions. The reality was more modest, but still substantial. Wood betony was a reliable bitter tonic for digestive complaints, a mild nervine for headache and anxiety, and a treatment for the dull chronic pain of tension, headache, and neuralgia that pioneer life generated in abundance. Pioneer women gave it for the headache that came behind the eyes after a day of difficult close work in poor light, for the stomach pain that accompanied stress and grief, and for the general debility of chronic overwork. The plant contains betaine and rosmarinic acid, with confirmed anti-inflammatory and mild analgesic properties. It is under-researched relative to its historical importance. That is itself a data point. Plants that cannot be patented do not attract pharmaceutical research funding. Number 2. Holy basil for stress and infection. Ocimum tenuiflorum, Tulsi or holy basil, arrived in frontier America through immigrant communities from South Asia who brought seeds because they needed this plant the way they needed food. In Ayurvedic tradition, Tulsi is considered an adaptogen, a plant that helps the body manage stress across multiple systems simultaneously. Pioneer women who encountered the plant through trade or immigrant networks adopted it because its properties were visible and convincing. Given as a daily tea, it reduced the frequency and severity of respiratory infections. Applied topically, the volatile oils were antimicrobial. Taken for anxiety and stress, it produced a measurable calming effect without sedation. Modern research has confirmed Tulsi's adaptogenic, antimicrobial, and anti-inflammatory properties across multiple studies. A randomized trial in 2012 confirmed Tulsi supplementation significantly improved cognitive function and reduced stress markers. The sacred plant of one medical tradition was practical medicine in another. Number 1. St. John's wort, the pioneer women's light medicine. In the months of winter isolation on the frontier, when the sun was low, the days were short, social contact was minimal, and the darkness pressed in from all sides, a specific kind of depression settled over pioneer communities that was distinct from grief and distinct from ordinary sadness. Today we understand it as seasonal affective disorder, driven by insufficient light exposure and the downstream hormonal effects. The pioneer women who recognized the pattern and treated it with St. John's wort, the yellow-flowered plant that bloomed at midsummer at the moment of maximum light, were making an observation that took modern medicine over a century to codify. Hyperforin and hypericin in St. John's wort modulate serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine simultaneously. A 2008 Cochrane systematic review analyzed 29 clinical trials involving 5,489 patients and concluded St. John's wort was comparable in efficacy to standard antidepressants, with significantly fewer side effects. The pioneer woman who kept the tincture for winter neighbors who stopped leaving the house was treating the correct condition with the pharmacologically correct plant. The laboratory agreed with her 5,489 patients later. 25 medicines. From women who were the only doctors their communities had, who trained for years through apprenticeship, who tracked outcomes across families and decades, who carried formal medical reference books alongside their Bibles, who learned from indigenous healers with centuries of knowledge about the local pharmacopoeia, and who got it right often enough that the communities they served survived. The knowledge they carried was erased not because it failed, but because a medical system that required licensing, equipment, and pharmaceutical products had no economic space for a woman in a kitchen garden who could heal a neighbor for free. Ask an older woman in your family what her grandmother kept in the garden. Write it down. Subscribe to Forgotten American Ways. This knowledge is one generation from silence.